The phone rang at 7 in the morning, and the voice on the other end belonged to a son-in-law I had never met in person. "My name is David Hale, I am 58 years old, and my daughter Sarah had not spoken to me in exactly 10 years. The man on the phone introduced himself as Mark Coleman, told me he was married to Sarah, and said she needed a kidney urgently. He explained, his voice shaking slightly, that Sarah's kidneys were failing rapidly, and doctors were searching desperately for a compatible living donor immediately. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, gripping the phone tightly, trying to process 10 years of silence collapsing into a single urgent call. Mark told me the transplant team had already tested Sarah's mother-in-law, 2 cousins, and several friends, none of them a viable match. He said quietly and almost apologetically that Sarah had specifically asked him not to call me, but he had called anyway out of desperation. I asked him why Sarah had refused to reach out herself, though some part of me already knew the painful answer to that question. 10 years earlier, my daughter had walked out of my house after a funeral and told me she never wanted to see me again. To understand how we reached that terrible day, you have to understand who Sarah and I were before everything between us fell apart. Sarah was my only child, born 8 years after her mother Carol and I married, the center of our entire small, quiet world. Carol used to say Sarah inherited my stubbornness and her own kindness, a combination that made our daughter fiercely loyal to the people she loved. We spent every summer at a small lake cabin, Sarah learning to fish beside me while Carol read novels on the dock. Sarah kept every single trophy from her softball years lined up carefully on a shelf in her childhood bedroom for years afterward. On her 16th birthday, I taught her to drive in an empty parking lot, both of us laughing nervously the entire afternoon. Sarah wrote me a letter before leaving for college, telling me I had been the kind of father she always hoped to have. I kept that letter folded inside my wallet for years, reading it quietly whenever I needed reminding of who I actually was. Carol always said watching Sarah and me together reminded her why she had married a man so completely devoted to family first. Those early years felt simple and complete, 3 people building a life together without any hint of the storm still waiting ahead. I never imagined, during those peaceful years, that grief and misunderstanding would eventually tear apart something we had built so carefully together. I coached her softball team for 6 years, drove her to piano lessons every Thursday, and never once missed a single school event growing up. Sarah and I had a tradition of Sunday morning pancakes, just the 2 of us, long after she outgrew spending time with her father. When Sarah left for college, she called me every single week, always ending our conversations by telling me she loved me before hanging up. Carol was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer when Sarah was 23 years old, freshly graduated, and just starting her first real job. We spent the following 18 months focused entirely on Carol's treatment, chemotherapy appointments, hospital visits, and the slow, exhausting rhythm of fighting cancer together. Sarah moved back home during that time, taking a leave from her job to help care for her mother during the worst of it. I remarried 3 years after Carol passed away, a decision Sarah struggled with deeply, though she never openly objected to it at the time. My second wife, Diane, had been a family friend for years, someone who had helped enormously during Carol's illness in ways I deeply appreciated. Sarah was polite to Diane at first, cautious but civil, attending holidays and family dinners despite what I now understand was quiet, growing discomfort. The trouble began the week of Carol's 5-year memorial service, when old grief and old wounds resurfaced in ways none of us expected. Sarah discovered, going through some of her mother's old paperwork, that a life insurance payout meant for her medical bills had partially disappeared. She confronted me directly at the memorial gathering, asking bluntly where nearly $40,000 from her mother's insurance policy had actually gone. I told her honestly that I did not know exactly what she meant, that Diane had handled most of the finances during that difficult period. Sarah's face changed in a way I had never seen before, a mixture of grief and fury directed entirely and completely at me. She accused me, in front of extended family, of letting her mother suffer while quietly diverting money that should have paid for better treatment. I remember standing frozen in my own living room, unable to fully explain something I genuinely did not understand myself at the time. Diane stood quietly near the kitchen doorway during that entire confrontation, saying almost nothing, while Sarah's accusations grew louder and more devastating by the minute. Sarah told me that day that she could never trust a man who let money matter more than his own wife's fight for survival. She packed a small bag before she left, telling me she needed time away, though none of us understood how permanent that time would become. Weeks turned into months, and my calls to Sarah went unanswered, my voicemails growing more desperate with every single passing week that went by. I sent letters explaining, as clearly as I could, that I had trusted Diane completely with our finances during the hardest year of my life. Sarah never responded to those letters, and eventually my sister told me Sarah had specifically asked our extended family not to share her new address. I missed her wedding to Mark Coleman 3 years later, learning about it only afterward through a mutual cousin who mentioned it in passing. That missed wedding became, in many ways, the moment I finally accepted that Sarah's silence was not temporary grief but a permanent, deliberate decision. Diane, for her part, always insisted Sarah was simply overwhelmed with grief and would eventually come around once enough time had passed. I wanted desperately to believe that explanation, clinging to it through birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries spent quietly wondering where my daughter actually was. Every year on Sarah's birthday, I sent a card to her last known address, never once receiving any response or even confirmation it arrived. I kept a folder in my desk drawer of every unanswered letter, unable to bring myself to throw away even the ones clearly ignored. Diane and I settled into a quiet life together, though I noticed, over the years, that she rarely wanted to discuss Sarah at all. Looking back now, I recognize a discomfort in Diane whenever Sarah's name came up, something I mistook for simple awkwardness rather than genuine guilt. 10 years is a long time to carry an unresolved wound, long enough that I had almost convinced myself I deserved my daughter's silence. That conviction shattered completely the moment Mark Coleman's voice came through my phone, asking whether I would consider testing as a donor. I attended my sister's holiday gatherings every year, always noticing the empty chair where Sarah used to sit during our family dinners. My sister occasionally mentioned small updates about Sarah's life, careful never to share too much information out of respect for Sarah's wishes. I drove past Sarah's old apartment building once, years after she moved out, simply sitting in my car remembering better days we once shared. Diane suggested more than once that I simply stop sending unanswered letters, insisting the silence was clearly a message I should accept. I refused to stop, telling her that a father's love did not simply disappear because a daughter needed distance and time to heal. Some nights, I sat alone in Sarah's old bedroom, unchanged since she left, wondering what I could have done differently back then. I never once considered that the true answer might involve someone else entirely, someone I trusted completely during those difficult grieving years. 10 years of quiet grief taught me patience I never knew I possessed, though patience never once made the silence hurt any less. I told Mark, without a single second of hesitation, that I would do absolutely anything necessary to help save my daughter's life. He gave me the name and address of the transplant center, explaining that testing needed to happen quickly given how rapidly Sarah's condition was declining. I drove to that hospital the very next morning, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire 90-minute drive there. The transplant coordinator, a calm woman named Dr. Patel, explained the compatibility testing process while I filled out paperwork with trembling hands. She told me the blood typing alone would take a few days, followed by more detailed tissue matching if the initial results looked promising. I asked her, carefully, whether Sarah knew I was there, and she told me gently that Sarah had specifically requested not to be told yet. That request hurt more than I expected, though I understood, somewhere beneath the pain, exactly why my daughter needed that particular boundary right now. I spent the following days waiting anxiously for test results, trying not to imagine what would happen if I was not a match. Mark called me on the 4th day, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, telling me the initial blood type results were compatible. He said the transplant team wanted to proceed with detailed tissue typing immediately, given how limited Sarah's remaining time actually was becoming. I asked him, hesitantly, how Sarah was holding up emotionally, knowing her own father might be the only person capable of saving her. Mark admitted that Sarah had cried when she learned I had come in for testing, though he could not tell whether from relief or resentment. The detailed tissue typing results came back 6 days later, showing I was an excellent match, one of the strongest possible outcomes medically. Dr. Patel told me this happens sometimes between biological parents and children, genetic compatibility remaining strong regardless of years of estrangement or silence. The hospital waiting room felt unbearably quiet during those days, filled only with the sound of my own anxious, repetitive thoughts circling endlessly. A nurse named Karen checked on me twice daily, gently reassuring me that waiting for results was the hardest part for everyone. I called Mark every evening during those days, asking careful questions about Sarah's condition without pushing for too many details each time we spoke. Mark told me Sarah's dialysis sessions were becoming increasingly difficult, her body growing weaker with every single passing week that went by. I researched kidney transplants obsessively during those waiting days, learning everything I could about recovery times and long-term outcomes for both donor and recipient. Dr. Patel explained that living donor kidneys generally lasted longer and functioned better than those from deceased organ donors typically did on average. That information gave me a strange, quiet comfort knowing that whatever happened next, I could offer Sarah the strongest possible chance at a full recovery. I signed every consent form without hesitation, understanding fully the risks involved, but never once considering any other possible choice for myself at all. I asked to see Sarah before agreeing to the surgery, needing, after 10 years, at least one honest conversation with my own daughter. Mark arranged the meeting carefully, choosing a small private hospital conference room rather than Sarah's actual room, understanding how much tension surrounded this reunion. Walking into that room and seeing Sarah for the first time in 10 years broke something open inside me I had not expected. She looked older, of course, tired in a way that worried me deeply, but unmistakably still my daughter sitting nervously across the table. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute, simply looking at each other. 10 years of silence sitting heavily in that small room. Sarah finally spoke first, telling me quietly that she never expected to need anything from me again, especially not something this enormous. I told her honestly that none of that mattered anymore, that I would give her a kidney regardless of anything unresolved between us. She asked me, her voice breaking slightly, whether I still denied taking that money from her mother's insurance policy all those years ago. I told her the truth, that I genuinely had not known where that money went, and that Diane had controlled our finances during that period. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, something between suspicion and exhausted curiosity, and she asked me to explain exactly what I meant by that. I explained that after Carol's diagnosis, overwhelmed with medical appointments and grief, I had given Diane full access to our joint accounts. Sarah asked whether I had ever actually reviewed the bank statements myself during that period, and I admitted, with growing unease, that I had not. That admission hung in the air between us, and I watched Sarah's face slowly shift from anger toward something closer to uncertain reconsideration. She told me she had confronted Diane directly once, years earlier, and Diane had denied any wrongdoing while insisting I alone controlled the money. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a suspicion I had never allowed myself to fully consider during 10 years of quiet guilt. I asked Sarah whether she still had any of the original paperwork from that period, bank statements, insurance documents, anything that might clarify things. She told me she had kept a box of her mother's old files, unable to throw them away despite the pain they represented. I asked if I could see that box, explaining that something about this entire situation suddenly felt different than I had understood for a decade. Sarah hesitated for a long moment before agreeing, telling me Mark could retrieve the box from their house later that same afternoon. While we waited, I told her about the folder of unanswered letters I had kept, proof of 10 years of attempts to reach her. She admitted, quietly, that she had received some of those letters but could never bring herself to open them without reliving that painful Memorial Day. Mark returned 2 hours later with a worn cardboard box, and Sarah and I began sorting through it together for the first time in years. Inside were old bank statements, insurance correspondence, and medical bills spanning the entire 18 months of Carol's treatment and eventual passing from cancer. I found a statement showing a $40,000 transfer out of our joint account, dated just 3 weeks before Carol's memorial service. The transfer had gone to an account I did not recognize, one that required careful cross-referencing with other documents to actually identify. Sarah found, buried near the bottom of the box, an old receipt for a down payment on a small vacation property in another state. The name on that property deed was Diane's alone, purchased using funds transferred from an account that had once belonged jointly to Carol and me. I sat staring at that receipt for a long time, feeling 10 years of guilt and confusion slowly reorganize themselves into something closer to clarity. Sarah asked quietly whether I truly had not known about any of this, and I told her honestly that I genuinely had not. She studied my face carefully, the same searching look she used to give me as a teenager whenever she suspected I was hiding something. Something in my expression must have convinced her, because she reached across the table and took my hand for the first time in 10 years. I asked her whether she would still consider hearing me out fully before we decided anything else about the surgery or about Diane. She nodded slowly, telling me she needed time to process everything, but that she no longer believed I had deliberately betrayed her mother's memory. I left the hospital that evening carrying the cardboard box, determined to understand exactly what had actually happened during those difficult 18 months. I called a forensic accountant recommended by an old colleague, a careful woman named Patricia Nguyen who specialized in tracing hidden financial transfers. Patricia reviewed the documents over the following week, confirming that the $40,000 transfer had indeed gone toward Diane's vacation property purchase. She found additional smaller transfers scattered across those 18 months, totaling nearly $15,000 more that I had never once questioned or noticed. I confronted Diane at home that evening, laying the documents on our kitchen table and asking her to explain exactly what I was looking at. Diane's face went pale immediately, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, simply staring down at the scattered paperwork between us. She finally admitted, her voice trembling, that she had taken the money during Carol's illness, believing at the time she deserved compensation for her care. I asked her how she could possibly justify letting Sarah believe, for 10 entire years, that I was the one responsible for that betrayal. Patricia Nguyen worked meticulously, tracing each transfer through 3 different accounts before finally connecting them to Diane's private property purchase outside of state. She explained that Diane had used our joint account's authorized signer status, something I had granted years earlier without ever revoking it. Patricia showed me copies of the wire transfer authorizations, each one bearing a signature that closely resembled my own handwriting in some strange way. I realized, with growing horror, that Diane had likely forged my signature on several of those authorization documents without me ever noticing. Patricia recommended we have the signatures independently verified by a forensic handwriting expert before confronting Diane with the complete evidence we had gathered. The handwriting expert confirmed within days that several signatures did not match mine, strengthening our case significantly before the confrontation we were about to have. Sarah asked to see every piece of evidence herself, insisting she needed to fully understand what had actually happened before confronting Diane. We spent an entire evening together reviewing everything Patricia had found, Sarah growing quieter and more resolved with every single document we examined that night. By the time we finished, Sarah told me she was ready to face Diane directly and hear her explanation in person once and for all. Diane told me she had never expected Sarah to actually discover the missing funds, assuming the confusion would simply fade away over time. She admitted she had let Sarah continue believing I was responsible because correcting the misunderstanding would have exposed her own theft immediately. I felt something in me finally break completely, 10 years of guilt and confusion collapsing into a clean, unmistakable anger toward my own wife. I told Diane that evening that our marriage was over, that I could not continue living with someone capable of that kind of betrayal. She tried, briefly, to explain herself further, but I told her firmly that no explanation could undo 10 lost years with my daughter. I called Sarah the next morning, telling her everything Diane had admitted, watching my own hands shake as I spoke the words aloud. Sarah was silent on the phone for a long time before asking whether I intended to press charges against Diane for what she had done. I told her I had already contacted a lawyer determined to pursue both the theft and the deliberate deception that had cost us a decade. Sarah asked if she could be present when I formally confronted Diane again, saying she needed to witness this conversation for her own healing. We arranged a meeting at my lawyer's office, a neutral space where Diane would face both Sarah and me together for the first time. Diane arrived looking smaller than I remembered, her usual composure completely gone, replaced by the visible weight of finally being fully exposed. My lawyer laid out the financial evidence methodically, the forensic accountant's report, the property deed, and every documented transfer traced back to Diane. Sarah spoke directly to Diane for the first time in years, telling her exactly how much those 10 lost editions immediately, clearly relieved that criminal prosecution might still be avoided if she cooperated completely and transparently now. We left that meeting with a signed confession, a restitution agreement, and something else neither Sarah nor I had expected to find that day, closure. Walking out of the lawyer's office together, Sarah turned to me and said she finally understood why I had genuinely believed I was innocent. I told her I understood, completely, why she had believed what she believed, given everything Diane had allowed her to think for 10 years. We stood together in that parking lot for a long time, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye after everything we had just processed. Sarah asked if I still wanted to proceed with the kidney donation, and I told her nothing had ever made me more certain of anything. The surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving both of us time to finish the pre-transplant medical evaluations and emotional preparation required. During those 3 weeks, Sarah and I spoke almost every day, slowly rebuilding a relationship neither of us had expected to ever recover. She told me stories about her life over the past 10 years, her career, her marriage to Mark, moments she had never shared with me. I told her about the quiet loneliness of those years, the unanswered letters, the birthday cards sent into what felt like permanent silence. We cried together more than once during those 3 weeks, releasing a decade of grief neither of us had ever properly allowed ourselves to feel. The morning of the surgery arrived gray and cold, both of us admitted to the same hospital wing for the first time in our lives. I remember being wheeled toward the operating room, catching one last glimpse of Sarah being prepared in the room right beside mine. The surgery took nearly 6 hours combined, my kidney carefully removed and transplanted into Sarah's body by a skilled and experienced surgical team. I woke up in recovery groggy and sore, but the first thing I asked the nurse was whether Sarah's surgery had gone well. She told me Sarah was stable, resting comfortably, and that the new kidney had already begun functioning almost immediately after the transplant. Mark visited my recovery room that evening, thanking me repeatedly, his eyes red from days of exhaustion and overwhelming relief combined together. I told him there was nothing to thank me for, that any father would have done exactly the same thing for his own child. Sarah and I recovered in rooms just down the hall from each other, nurses walking updates between us throughout those first uncertain days. On the third day, strong enough to walk slowly with assistance, I made my way down the hallway to see my daughter directly. She was sitting up in bed when I arrived, pale but smiling, the first genuine smile I had seen from her in over 10 years. I sat beside her bed, and she reached for my hand the way she used to when she was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. Neither of us said much at first, simply sitting together in comfortable silence, something we had not shared in an entire decade of estrangement. Sarah finally told me she was sorry for the years of silence, though I insisted immediately that she had nothing at all to apologize for. I told her the only person who owed either of us an apology had already given one, however inadequate it ultimately felt in comparison. We spent that entire afternoon talking quietly, filling in 10 years of missing conversations, missed birthdays, and unspoken love neither of us had abandoned. Diane, true to her signed agreement, transferred the full restitution amount within the following month, along with the notarized confession Sarah had requested. Sarah and I decided together not to pursue criminal charges, choosing instead to focus our remaining energy on rebuilding what estrangement had cost us. I sold the house Diane and I had shared, unable to imagine continuing to live somewhere so deeply connected to 10 years of quiet betrayal. I moved into a smaller place closer to Sarah and Mark, wanting, for the first time in a decade, to actually be nearby. Recovery from the surgery took several months for both of us, slow physical healing running parallel to something even slower and more important, emotional healing. Sarah invited me to Sunday dinners again, reviving a tradition neither of us had spoken about since she was a teenager living at home. We never quite returned to Sunday morning pancakes exactly, but we found new rituals, new routines built on honesty rather than assumed understanding. I met Sarah's closest friends for the first time, people who had supported her through a decade I had known almost nothing about. She showed me photographs from her wedding, the one I had missed entirely, and I felt grief and gratitude tangled together in equal measure. Mark told me privately, one evening, how much it had meant to Sarah watching her father show up without hesitation when she needed him most. I told him honestly that showing up was the easiest decision I had ever made, regardless of everything unresolved between Sarah and me. The hardest part, I told him, had been the 10 years before that phone call, the silence I had never fully understood how to break. Sarah's health continued improving steadily over the following months, her energy slowly returning as her body adjusted to its new healthy kidney. I attended every follow-up appointment I could, sitting beside her in waiting rooms, determined never again to be absent from her life. One evening, nearly 6 months after the surgery, Sarah asked me quietly why I had never simply demanded to see the bank records myself. I told her honestly that trust, once given completely, becomes difficult to question, even when every instinct should have told me something was wrong. She said she understood that now, in a way she could not have understood 10 years earlier, still raw from her mother's death. We talked, for the first time, about Carol directly, sharing memories neither of us had been able to discuss during those 10 silent years. Sarah told me she had visited her mother's grave every year on the anniversary, something I had never known during our entire estrangement. I told her I had visited too, though apparently on different days. 2 grieving people separately mourning the same woman for an entire decade. We decided, together, to visit the cemetery on the same day this time, standing side by side at Carol's grave for the first time. Sarah placed fresh flowers beside the headstone, telling her mother quietly that her father and she had finally found their way back to each other. I stood there beside my daughter, grateful in a way words could barely capture for a kidney for the truth and for this moment. Diane moved out of state after everything settled, and I heard, through mutual acquaintances, that she rarely spoke about what had happened between our families. I did not think about her often anymore, my energy entirely focused on the relationship I had nearly lost permanently because of her silence. Sarah asked me once whether I could ever forgive Diane completely, and I told her honestly that forgiveness felt like an ongoing, difficult process. I told her I had forgiven the theft itself far more easily than I had forgiven the 10 years of stolen time with my daughter. Sarah nodded, telling me she felt exactly the same way, that some losses could be repaid financially while others simply could not be measured. We agreed that the true justice in this story was not Diane's confession or restitution, but the two of us finding our way back. A year after the surgery, Sarah and Mark invited me to a small family dinner celebrating the anniversary of the transplant that saved her life. I stood in their kitchen, helping Sarah cook the same recipes Carol once made, feeling closer to both of them than I had in years. Mark raised a toast that evening, thanking me formally in front of their closest friends for giving Sarah a second chance at life. I told everyone gathered that evening that Sarah had actually given me something equally precious, a second chance at being her father again. Looking back now, I understand that Diane's betrayal cost us 10 years, but it never once managed to destroy what Sarah and I actually shared. The bond between a father and daughter, I learned slowly through all of this, can survive even a decade of painful, misplaced silence. What ultimately saved us was not the surgery alone, but the willingness of two hurting people to finally sit down and ask honest questions. I think often about how close we came to losing each other permanently, Sarah's illness becoming the unexpected bridge back across 10 lost years. If Sarah had never needed that kidney, I sometimes wonder whether the truth about Diane would have ever surfaced at all between us. I try not to dwell too long on that particular question, choosing instead to focus on the relationship we have carefully rebuilt since then. Sarah calls me every Sunday now, just like she did during her college years, always ending our conversations by telling me she loves me. I keep a photograph from that first hospital reunion on my nightstand, a reminder of exactly how close we came to running out of time. People sometimes ask me if I regret trusting Diane so completely during those early years after Carol's death, given everything that happened afterward. I tell them honestly that I do not regret the trust itself, only the fact that I never once questioned it during 10 quiet years. Trust, I learned through all of this, should never mean surrendering all curiosity, especially when the people we love depend on our careful attention. Sarah tells people now that her father literally saved her life twice, once with a kidney, and once by finally uncovering the truth. I tell her, every time, that she saved mine just as completely, giving me back 10 years of love I thought I had permanently lost. We still visit Carol's grave together every year now, standing side by side rather than separately mourning the same woman we both deeply loved. Sarah's health remains strong, her new kidney functioning well, her energy fully returned to the vibrant, determined woman I remembered from years earlier. I think about Diane sometimes, not with the burning anger I once felt, but with a quiet sadness for the family she chose to destroy. She had years of opportunity to tell the truth and simply chose silence instead, a choice that cost all of us far more than money. I do not know if she understands, even now, exactly how much those 10 years actually meant to a father and his only daughter. What I know for certain is that Sarah and I found our way back to each other against odds neither of us expected to overcome. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this story to understand, it is that truth, however delayed, is always worth pursuing. 10 years of silence nearly cost me my daughter permanently, but a kidney transplant and a box of old bank statements brought her home. I am grateful every single day now for Sunday dinners, for pancake mornings occasionally revived, and for a daughter who finally knows the whole truth. Sarah and I are not the same people we were before any of this happened, but I believe, in many ways, we are stronger now. We rebuilt our relationship on something far more durable than the assumed trust that once nearly destroyed it: honest, difficult, necessary conversation. I gave my daughter a kidney because I loved her completely, even during 10 years when she believed I had betrayed everything we once shared. That love, it turns out, never actually disappeared during those silent years. It simply waited patiently for the truth to finally catch up. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Mark had listened to Sarah's original request and simply never called me at all. That single phone call, made against Sarah's explicit wishes, ultimately saved both her life and our fractured relationship permanently together in the end. Mark tells me now that making that call was the hardest decision of his life, disobeying his wife out of desperate love. I thank him regularly for that difficult choice, understanding fully how much courage it took to defy Sarah's explicit instructions that painful morning. Sarah has since told Mark she forgives him completely, admitting she probably would have made the exact same choice herself given enough time. Our family gathers now every single Sunday, a tradition none of us take for granted after everything we nearly permanently lost during those silent years. I have learned to ask more questions now, in every relationship, refusing to let assumed trust ever replace honest, open communication again. Sarah says the same lesson applies to her own life now, questioning things more carefully, rather than assuming silence means understanding or acceptance. We both agree now that the 10 lost years, though painful, ultimately taught us lessons neither of us could have learned any other way. Sarah tells me now that she regrets nothing about the painful journey that brought us back together, believing it made our bond unbreakable permanently. I agree with her completely, though I still wish, quietly, that we had found the truth sooner and spared ourselves an entire lost decade. What matters most now is not the 10 years we lost, but the years we have promised each other we will never lose again. Every Sunday, when Sarah calls, I think about that first phone call from Mark and how close we came to never making this call. I am endlessly grateful he ignored Sarah's request and called me anyway, choosing his wife's survival over her understandable, deeply hurt pride. Sometimes the people who love us most make difficult choices on our behalf, choices that eventually reveal themselves as exactly what we truly needed. I close this story the same way I closed that hospital room door after our first reunion, grateful, humbled, and finally, completely at peace.